This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare, anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare Anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, on to the episode.
Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Elise. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm also doing pretty well.
I'm super excited today to talk about early modern travel narratives, stories of travel in Shakespeare's time, and how they may have influenced Shakespeare while he was writing The Tempest. What sort of narratives existed about the world outside of England during Shakespeare's time?
Yes, and what a perfect time to talk about travel narratives and traveling while we are in the midst of our hot Shakespeare summer.
Yes, when we've been doing a little traveling ourselves, we've shared our own travel narratives over on our Patreon, and we are encouraging all of our fellow Shakespeare nerds to go out and see some Shakespeare this summer or do some Shakespeare this summer and share it with us on Instagram by tagging @ShakespeareAnyonePod and using hashtag #HotShakespeareSummer.
Yes, and if you don't have Instagram, Elise, you actually received an email. Well,
yes,
we received an email. Elise checks our emails. Just full disclosure. And you received a Hot Shakespeare Summer via email.
Via email, I just want to say special thanks to our Patreon patron, Lisa, who reached out via email to share with us how she has experienced Hot Shakespeare Summer in Austria. And she got to see a Shakespeare production in the garden where the captain and Maria dance in Sound of Music. The pictures are very cool. Lisa gave us permission to share them on our Instagram because she does not have Instagram. So thank you, Lisa, for sending those in. And if you want to participate in Hot Shakespeare Summer, because we are giving away some merch this summer to people who participate, if you want to participate and don't have Instagram, you can do what Lisa did and email us your Hot Shakespeare Summer travel narrative. Speaking of Patreon, we also have two brand new Patreon patrons who we'd love to thank for their support. That is Benjamin Richardson and Nick. Thank you both so much for your support of the podcast.
Listeners and Patreon patrons help keep this podcast growing. So we really appreciate your support. And if anyone else listening wants to become a part of that Patreon family, you can go to our Patreon and select a tier that's right for you at patreon.com/ShakespeareAnyone.
Now, let's dive into early modern travel narratives. First things first, I'm going to start off talking a little bit more about travel narratives in general. And then, Courtney, you've got a travel narrative that scholars generally agree influenced The Tempest.
Yes. Yeah. And I want to also just start out by saying, Shakespeare was writing in this very interesting time where colonialism was at its infancy, what scholar Jyotsna Singh calls proto-colonialism. And so there's a lot of discussion about the influences that travel narratives had, whether they were influencing the kind of colonialism that was soon to come for the British Empire.
And if you want to hear more about the role of travel narratives in the documentation and potential promotion of these colonial ideas, the colonial ideology, we have multiple episodes where we have gone through all of Jyotsna Singh's book on Shakespeare and proto-colonialism. Those are our mini on Shakespeare and the Colonial Imagination, Commerce and Trade in Shakespeare's Time, Shakespeare's World, Immigrants, Others, and Foreign Commodities, and Decolonize the Mind through Shakespeare.
Yeah, so if you want to check out proto-colonialism through a more post-colonial lens, those are available. We will talk more about colonialism and the Tempest and like race in another episode. But right now, we're actually going to be taking a broader look at travel narratives. So, Elise,
yes,
what was your reading about?
I want to talk briefly about travel narratives as a genre. Travel narratives were a popular genre, as we mentioned in previous episodes, and it's actually a type of literary genre that goes back to ancient times. People have been writing and sharing about their travels, and they still do to this day. We still have travel blogs or travel YouTube channels where people, or, Rick Steves Europe, where people go and share about places that exist around the world, and it is intended to be consumed by people back home. This is not something that is unique to the early modern period. This is something that sort of humans have always done. They happen to be incredibly popular in Shakespeare's time. My reading focuses on 3 travel narratives that come from Richard Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics, and Discoveries of the English Nation. And these travel narratives are not about English colonies in North America, which makes them unique in the literature we have. It also makes them very understudied. There's been a lot of study in the travel narratives. The travel narratives relate to colonialism.
Which makes a lot of sense because there were so many dire consequences to this kind of travel.
Yes. I think it's also helpful to have this broader context of this was not the only kind of travel that was happening at this time. As a refresher, in the latter part of the 1500s, Richard Hakluyt compiled and edited letters, logs, diaries, and the stories of English travel and exploration throughout the world, and published these materials in several editions, the last of which is the 3-volume Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics, and the Discoveries of the English Nation that I mentioned earlier, which was published between 1598 to 1600. And my reading comes from an article by David C. Judkins entitled Travel Literature of the Early Modern Period. Judkins notes that, quote, Hakluyt's stated aim for collecting these accounts was to authenticate and legitimize English claims to newly located territories. But he accomplished much more. He preserved useful geographical information. He gave travel literature a more factual basis and turned it away from the book of marvels and monsters approach that had characterized the genre through the ancient and medieval periods. He assembled an interesting collection of nonfiction prose that provides a foundation for the later development of fictional prose. Finally, he preserved an invaluable record of early English response to foreign cultures, unquote. So Judkins takes this very interesting look at 3 narratives from Hakluyt to show that while Hakluyt's primary goal was the promotion of colonialism, he actually does achieve more than just that. These volumes are not just purely pro-colonialism propaganda. There's more in there than that. What these 3 narratives in particular show is that the sort of like stereotype that is created from the pro-colonial narratives of English people looking down on other cultures is not consistently present in all early modern travel narratives in the 1500s. As we say on here, early modern England, not a monolith.
Right. And he was also taking narratives that were written by other people. He wasn't going to these places and writing his own opinions, right? It was collecting.
Right. He's collecting. There's some that may have been dictated to him, but he's essentially sort of like being a reporter and publishing interviews or publishing other people's writings in a volume. So these 3 men are Anthony Jenkinson, Miles Phillips, and Ralph Fitch. All 3 of these men were travelers, not explorers, and what they write about is new to them, but it wasn't new to European readers. They're talking about places that there have been travel narratives written about before. However, they are uniquely descriptive, and according to Judkins, quote, although they speak from a Eurocentric and more specifically an Anglo-centric point of view, they seem less ideologically judgmental than most of their contemporaries. Their strongest criticisms are directed not toward the indigenous peoples they encounter, but toward other Europeans they meet, unquote. So, as I mentioned earlier, none of these accounts are concerned with the early history of the land that would become the United States, so they're not as well known or studied as accounts that involve early history of the United States. So, first up is Anthony Jenkinson. He travels to Russia and northern Persia to trade. And he is really disappointed by the conditions in Russia, specifically in the city of Astrakhan, which he hoped would be really rich with treasures, but instead he finds a city that he describes as, quote, most destitute and barren of wood and pasture, and the ground will bear no corn. The air is there most infected by a reason, as I suppose, of much fish, and especially sturgeon, by which on the inhabitants live. They hang their fish in their streets and houses to dry, and their provision, which causeth such abundance of flies to increase there, as the like was never seen in any land to their great plague, unquote. So he is not impressed. He doesn't like the practices of the people of Astrakhan. He also describes that there's a great famine and plague amongst the inhabitants, but specifically among Tartar refugees who sought refuge in Russia during this time. But according to him, were, quote, but ill-entertained or relieved, for there died a great number of them for hunger, which lay all the island through in heaps dead, and like to beasts unburied, very pitiful to behold, unquote. So he's really not impressed with these people who he understands as also Europeans, like the Russians. He doesn't like how they're treating the refugees in their country. He's just like really he expected more.
Mm-hmm.
But in comparison, he describes his encounter with the king of Hyrcania, which is a region that covered parts of modern-day Iran and Turkmenistan. His description of encountering the king of Hyrcania was much more complimentary. He described the king as, quote, a prince of mean stature and of a fierce countenance, richly apparelled with garments of silk and cloth of gold, unquote, and describes how they discussed religion, with the king being Muslim and Jenkinson being Christian. And Judkins notes that this particular description is like kind of out of place in Jenkinson's accounts and may have been something that was a little bit like inserted or overplayed for the English audience.
Yeah, like a publishing choice, maybe.
A publishing choice, or just something that like he embellished a little, because in the rest of his narrative, he's a very like astute businessman and he's there to do trade, and offending the king of Hyrcania or the Sophie is not like good business practice.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Like, so, he wrote it. It's not an insert from the publisher. It's him writing in a way that's
it's him writing that's a little bit out of like
character.
Out of character. That seems just a little bit like maybe overstated, so that like Judkins basically is like, there's potential doubt that like this conversation happened in the way he describes it, and it's possibly just put in there more so that like English people back home would be like, oh, good, he still stood up for being a good Christian.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Jenkinson also describes other rulers in northern Persia as generous and rich in personal goods. And according to Judkins, he, quote, goes to some lengths to describe his often kind treatment by local sultans and kings. He does not engage them in theological arguments, and missionary initiatives are not part of his agenda, unquote. So that's why the conversation with the king of Hyrcania is a little bit like, really? Or did you just have to like say that you did it to appease, anybody
the readers back home.
The readers back home.
Yeah.
It kind of reads as like they both agree to disagree that like the other is an unbeliever.
Yeah. But it's a good business practice for him if he's,
Yeah. So yeah, he's not really talking to them about religion in any other encounter. So that's Jenkinson, is that like he is really actually impressed with his travels in northern Persia and Hyrcania, and way less impressed with Russia when he travels there. Then Miles Phillips is someone who was a page under John Hawkins and sailed to Mexico on a slaving expedition in 1568. After a bad storm near Veracruz, the ship was attacked by the Spanish fleet when it entered the port, and John Hawkins set 114 of his men ashore to fend for themselves so that the badly damaged ship had a chance of getting back to England. Your face. Yeah. He basically was like, the ship's so bad, I'm like so badly damaged that I don't think it can get home with 114 of my employees on there. So
off you go.
Good luck. Off you go. Here's Mexico. Stay in Mexico. I promise I'll be back in a year to get you.
Yeah. Pinky promise. Pinky promise. I'll be back.
Phillips describes that what happens next is that the group is attacked by Native Americans, but that it was a mistake. The natives thought that the group was Spanish, and when they discovered the group was English, they assisted the survivors, the people who had been
abandoned,
marooned.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the Spanish, on the other hand, who were actively colonizing Mexico, what is now Mexico, Even when the English professed themselves Catholic, the Spanish insisted that the English group were quote-unquote Lutheran heretics, and according to Phillips, put all of the English group on the rack and killed some for being here because this is the Spanish Inquisition. Because this is the Spanish Inquisition that they're facing. Phillips, unlike the rest of the group, possibly due to his youth, was not held as accountable for his religious views as those who were killed for them. But he was sentenced to 5 years of involuntary servitude in a monastery, during which time he was tasked with overseeing Native American slaves who were being forced to build a church. Phillips then learns the language of these indigenous people around him and describes them in his narrative as, quote, a courteous and loving kind of people, ingenious and of great understanding, and they hate and abhor the Spaniards with all their hearts. They have used such horrible cruelties against them, and do still keep them in such subjugations and servitude that they and the black slaves do daily lay in wait to practice their deliverance out of that thraldom, unquote. So he writes very eloquently of these non-English people, these non-Europeans, with a lot of compassion, a lot of understanding. And in contrast, he is severely critical of the Spanish and the Inquisition. The indigenous people help Phillips attempt to escape his inquisitors. Some help him file off his shackles, others guide him through the forests of Central America until he reaches Honduras and is able to get on a ship to Havana. Phillips, quote, regards these men as helping another human in distress, unquote, and credits them with his survival and return to England. However, Judkins notes, quote, the fact that he had earlier participated in the enslavement of those with whom he now sympathizes never comes up, nor can it be said that his story is underpinned by moral enlightenment, unquote. Phillips tends to understate his personal feelings and opinions throughout the narrative, so it's not just on that topic. He's really just kind of being like, here are the things that happened to me, these were the events, and doesn't add his own feelings or thoughts anywhere in this narrative.
Yeah, like it's very clinical or very just...
It's very clinical, yeah. So, I think we would wish for him to have included some personal reflection on his actions and what he now understood of the people that he was around, but that just doesn't exist in there.
Yeah, that is a shame because he's like writing sympathetically, but it's more revolving around his own survival.
Yeah, it's very self-centered. And it's in contrast to his critiques of the Spanish. He doesn't really fully flesh out other characters. Judkins also notes that it's possible that Phillips was illiterate and therefore dictated his narrative to Hakluyt. So there may, I think, if that's
we
true,
just won't
then
know. Yeah.
Then that may account for the clinical nature of it. That this is coming from someone's notes who may have depersonalized and undercharacterized. Because Judkins also notes that the other people in this narrative are underdeveloped and undercharacterized and kind of very generalized. So if it is true that Phillips dictated, it's possible that's how Hakluyt recounted it.
Yeah, and knowing what we know about Hakluyt's opinion about colonialism, and then it could make sense to strip it of that kind of human experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even if it is stripped by Hakluyt, I think that it is worth noting that there is still a very compassionate description of non-European, non-English people.
Mm-hmm.
Last but not least is Ralph Fitch. He set sail, quote, to investigate the well-known trade route across the Mediterranean to Aleppo, thence across Syria to Basra, and down the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean and Western India, unquote. As by 1582, some merchants were giving up on trying to find northeast and northwest passages to India because, boats weren't coming back, and they opted instead for the route that was under control of the Italians and Portuguese. Everything goes well for Fitch until they reach Ormuz, which is near the mouth of the Persian Gulf, where they are arrested, and the group is arrested and sent to Goa on the east coast of India, which is where the Portuguese had colonies and continued Fitch's group's imprisonment. Eventually, the group was able to convince the Portuguese that they were Catholic, and they were then bailed out by an English Jesuit priest. Fitch became a merchant in Goa, but then fled northeast when rumors that the Portuguese were going to send the Englishmen to Lisbon. Fitch eventually finds himself in the upper bay of Bengal. According to Judkins, in Fitch's narrative, quote, He comments on the standard subjects: child marriage, polygamy, beggars, poverty, and idolatry. His tone is that of a reporter, somewhat objective, yet he cannot resist some judgments, unquote. For example, he describes a man that locals treat as a prophet as a quote-unquote lazy lover, and says that, quote, the people of these countries be given to such prating and dissembling hypocrites, unquote. So he's not like as sympathetic and empathetic as the others. Of the three, he's the most judgy. However, more interestingly, when he travels to Pegu, an ancient city located in Myanmar, he describes it as comfortable and says that the, quote, streets are the fairest that I ever saw, unquote. And he spends a lot of time describing the elephants that were kept by the king. His description of Pegu is the fullest and most complete description of this ancient capital of Buddhist culture in English at this point in history.
Mm-hmm.
According to Judkins, quote, no other English person gives so thorough a description of this well-developed city, unquote. Fitch is investigating trade routes, and like his entire narrative is part a report back to his employers, part like trying to pitch trade innovations for England. And so he clearly sees that there is potential for trade in Pegu, which is something of a free trade zone where no European country had a significant presence at this point. He then goes south to Malacca on the Malaysian peninsula and describes the Portuguese fort there. And then he returns to Pegu and stays there for 6 months. So he clearly really liked this city in Myanmar. And so these three narratives just sort of paint a broader picture of the breadth of travel narratives available at the time, that they, as we mentioned earlier, they're not all about colonialism. They don't all have the goal of colonialism. They don't all look down their noses at non-European cultures. Some of them are actually very appreciative. All three of them are very appreciative of and admiring of at least one other non-European culture. While they are Anglo-centric, they are not Anglo-supremacist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And that's really fascinating. It makes me think, and there will be Shakespeare plays that we'll look at where there are non-European, non-English characters that are introduced. I'm thinking of in The Merchant of Venice with the three caskets. And we have non-European, non-English characters. And, you know, knowing this, what might Shakespeare have brought in from other travel narratives that were not about, you know, the
superiority
Caribbean
of the English over everyone else in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that we've talked previously on the podcast, specifically like in our episodes on race with Titus Andronicus and just Shakespeare depicting the other during his time. Othering was more about nationality and certainly religion than it was about skin color at this time. And that the understanding of race as we understand it in 2025 America today is not the same understanding or even concept that Shakespeare would have had. And so it's interesting to see these travel narratives that do depict the other, the non-Europeans, in such a empathetic light and such a humanizing light, instead of, you know, some of the proto-colonialism narratives are very dehumanizing to non-Europeans. And that's certainly the narrative that is just more widely talked about, especially in the United States with the early history of the United States.
Yeah. And just last piece is it's interesting, especially coming off of Henry V, knowing the othering of the French. It's always just nice to hear kind of the alternatives to the kind of mainstream conversation.
Yes. Or the conversation that's been mainstreamed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. What I want to do now is I want to go ahead and get into what I read, which is looking very specifically at a travel narrative that we have already talked about, more of the traditional mainstream. I want to dive more into the True Repertory, which is the letter by William Strachey that generally it's a scholarly consensus that this letter influenced and inspired Shakespeare when he was writing The Tempest. And so I read an article called William Strachey's True Repertory and Shakespeare, A Closer Look at the Evidence by Alden T. Vaughan. And we've talked about Strachey's letter before in our Stuff to Chew On. We've talked about it in our post-colonial theory episodes from, I think our first one, we talked about it when we talked about proto-colonialism and travel narratives. And now I want to talk about the evidence as well as this discourse about the letter and kind of how controversial it can be to some to claim that Shakespeare was inspired by this letter.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to first start by contextualizing why the letter was important. So, England had unexpected news in September 1610 that everyone aboard the Virginia Company's Sea Venture, that's the name of the ship, had survived an Atlantic hurricane and reached Bermuda. Prior to that, there were reports that a ship had been shipwrecked and there was no answer to the survivors. And so, like I said in our Stuff to Chew On when we discussed it last time, the answer of the survivors came by way of William Strachey's letter to an anonymous, quote, excellent lady, unquote. So there's this letter written to an anonymous lady or an excellent lady, and that really was one of the pieces that arrived that let England know that there were survivors. The true repertory did not reach print until 1625 when it was published in Samuel Purchas's anthology, Purchas His Pilgrims. And the assumption is that Shakespeare somehow read Strachey's manuscript or a copy prior to this publication, and that influenced The Tempest. However, a recent essay is challenging this and accuses Strachey of plagiarism and says that the letter was not written in 1610 and it arrived in England way too late to influence The Tempest. And my author that I'm reading, he is basically going to disprove and speak against this claim that the letter was falsified. So the article that I'm discussing reviews what Vaughan calls revisionist, factual, and interpretive shortcomings. Vaughan is here to set the record straight. So here's the context and content of Strachey's true repertory. So Strachey's letter begins with Richard Hakluyt, who you mentioned, who was the editor of the Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics, and Discoveries of the English Nation. And Hakluyt's final volume that you mentioned was published in 1600, but he continued to collect, translate, and publish travel narratives before his death in 1616. Upon his death, Samuel Purchas, if you recognize the Purchas His Pilgrims, Samuel Purchas acquired these texts from Hakluyt in order to create the final and largest edition of Hakluyt's Principal Navigations. So he didn't publish these letters that he had collected after the 1600 publication, but he had collected stuff since 1600. And now Samuel Purchas acquired these texts and, kind of similar to the Chronicles, Holinshed's Chronicles, was going to continue the legacy of Hakluyt's work. And so in 1625, Purchas published all of these travel narratives as his Purchas His Pilgrims, and he gave the work the pre-title Hakluyt's Posthumous to give credit to his predecessor and the work that he had been doing publishing.
And tie the legacy of the work too. Okay.
Yeah. And so Strachey's report has a very long title, and it's very in the fashion of early modern England, these very, very long titles. And so the full title of Strachey's letter is A True Repertory of the Wreck and Redemption of Sir Thomas Gates, Knight, upon and from the islands of the Bermudas, his coming to Virginia, and the estate of that colony then and after upon the government of the Lord Delaware. So that is the whole title of Strachey's report. I'm going to talk about the publishing of this work. Because some of the works were collected by Hakluyt, some of them were collected by Purchas, some of them were kind of a combination of both of their collection. Purchas marked each kind of piece with either H if it was Hakluyt's collection, and then an H and P if it was the two of them combined. And then if it has no letter, it's just assumed that it's a part of Purchas's collection. Yeah.
Okay.
And so this one was marked with an H, indicating it was from Hakluyt's collection. And Strachey's report is an account that is, in total, a 24,000-word autobiographical account of Strachey's experiences from mid-1609 to mid-1610 on the Sea Venture's journey to Virginia, and it includes, quote, a dreadful storm and hideous, unquote, the seemingly miraculous crash on Bermuda, the eventful months there in the Bermudas, including the construction of 2 pinnacles, the final leg to Jamestown, the Virginia colony's deplorable condition, and Virginia's history from late May to mid-July 1610, and then, most notably, Lord Delaware's arrival in the colony. So that's kind of like the all-encompassing what Strachey's letter is about.
Mm-hmm.
Shakespeare does not take from all of that, but it's a very long account. And when Strachey's letter was published in Purchas His Pilgrims, Purchas also included additional information following Strachey's report to like better contextualize the time. Like it included a declaration by the colonists as well as an account of colonial cannibalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to do a shout out to Carson Brackey for her work in hospitality and cannibalism. And Vaughan notes that Strachey's letter may have been amended by Hakluyt, who was trying to write stirring narratives, but was also a supporter of the Virginia Company. So there's that like pro-colonialism, pro-colonizing, pro-British Empire propaganda that Hakluyt was really interested in pushing with his works. And Strachey painted the colony in a grim light. He wrote about a murder that happened in the colony, an execution, and several conspiracies and mutinies. And so Strachey's expose was bad public relations for the Virginia colony that was seeking funds and colonists. And so it might have been amended due to that. You know, who's going to want to go invest in the colony if there's murder and there's conspiracies and it's just in total chaos. On the other hand, Strachey praised Bermuda's island resources. And this contradicted Bermuda's century-long reputation as inaccessible, except by shipwreck, and inhospitable. For example, frightful sounds, storms, and apparitions. What does that sound like?
The Tempest?
Yeah. So there's this narrative that Bermuda was this kind of uninhabitable, spooky place.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, there was another account of the shipwreck that was written by Sylvester Jourdain, and that is called Discovery of Bermudas. It was written around the same time as Strachey's letter, and it also flattered the Bermudas less, and it became a Virginia Company propaganda pamphlet. And the importance of this is that when Strachey's letter arrived in London in 1610, the Virginia Company was still trying to build Virginia up and needed private investors and directors. But by the publication of Purchas His Pilgrims, the Virginia Company was defunct, and now an expose about how bad the conditions were wouldn't really be a problem for the growth of the colony. Like, the colony had grown in population, the Virginia Company was defunct, and so now, like, the negative information that Strachey was writing about would not have been necessarily detrimental to the growth of the colony. Yeah, all of this information that I'm giving you is more about the publication of Strachey's letter in Purchas His Pilgrims, the one that came out in 1625. And so you're thinking 1625, Shakespeare was not writing The Tempest. He was not writing at all.
Nope.
So how is this influencing Shakespeare's play? But Vaughan writes that it is almost certain that 2 or more manuscript versions of Strachey's letter circulated within the company and his friends. So the document was written to be a public letter, a narrative that he intended for the widest possible circulation as a manuscript or print. And there's a difference between a manuscript or a print. And so, like, the manuscript, today we think of manuscripts as something that is like
handwritten, a draft.
Yeah, exactly. A draft, and then
a pre-publication.
Yes. Yeah,
version,
exactly.
Yeah.
But the manuscript would have gone around in that time, and I don't actually know the exact specificities of that publishing practice. So maybe we'll get to that in a mini episode.
Yeah, but it sounds not too dissimilar to like the difference between a pamphlet, something that's a little bit more disposable but meant for wide readership, or like the broadside ballads, like all these, quick, easy printing, quick, easy, cheaper than like the bound book publishing at this time. That like there was so much more. The publishing industry was in having an absolute boom era, but there was just like so much more that like we have lost of non-bound materials, of like broadside ballads,
pamphlets, diaries,
just like sheets of paper that were printed.
So even though it wasn't printed until 1625, manuscripts were going around, possibly within the company.
It wasn't officially published in the way that we think of publishing.
Yeah, it's not like in the stationer's register or anything like that.
Yeah, it's a zine.
And so that is how his letter very well could have been circulating in London, even though it wasn't published in print until 1625. And now I have a little bit of like archaeology history to bring into the mix. So Until 1983, no manuscript copy of Strachey's letter was known to exist. Hakluyt and Purchas's documents have also vanished. You mentioned there's just a lot that we have lost.
Mm-hmm.
But a 19th century copyist version of True Repertory was found in a trunk of family papers in Bermuda. And archaeologist historian Noel Hume purchased the manuscript and concluded that it almost certainly represents Strachey's rough draft, shorter in length. And I think the importance of noting that it very likely is a copy of the rough draft is because Vaughan states that there are differences between the shorter letter that was found in that trunk in Bermuda compared to the published one from Hakluyt and Purchas's collection. So that may indicate that the shorter one was written when the fate of the Sea Venture was uncertain, and then the longer one was written 5 weeks after the company arrived in Virginia. So Strachey has this shorter letter that he's expecting to try to get out quickly about what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back to, someone finds the letter, there's a survivor, it goes back to England, and people know what happened. But they survived, so he could keep writing, and he may have amended stuff. But yeah, there's a high possibility that the shorter length is a reflection of like a rough draft compared to the 5 week later in the count.
Yeah. Or like you said, like trying to write something quick and get it, like just get proof out there versus like a full account.
Yes. Yeah. And so we know that there are survivors of the shipwreck,
Mm-hmm.
and they continued along the travels up to Virginia. And upon arriving in Virginia, Strachey was chosen to be the colony's new secretary and recorder, which is an opportunity for advancement. And also, like, he's already, recording the travels, but,
Mm-hmm.
he could have very well been recording a lot of this because he was the new secretary and recorder. And then the way that the letter got to England was by a vessel that was bringing mail and other things back to England from Virginia as part of like protocols, I suppose, for like
Mm-hmm.
bringing letters back and forth from the colony back to England. And so Sir Thomas Gates is the, I guess, like the postal guy, the guy that, the early modern postal man. I think he had a different title. I haven't looked it up, but basically he served as, somebody bringing the mail over to
Yes.
England in 1610. And so that's how the letter arrived in England. Okay, that's that. However, there are arguments against Strachey's influence on the Tempest, and these arguments rarely appear in peer-reviewed journals, but they're out there.
Mm.
And so Vaughan picks two of the arguments against this and corrects them, essentially. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that because I don't want to peddle conspiracy theories, even if they're early modern conspiracy theories. But I'm going to kind of like high level go through these two conspiracies.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is from Arthur F. Kinney's Revisiting the Tempest. And Kinney argues that Shakespeare couldn't have seen a document at quote-unquote court because he didn't have access to the court. Your face.
His patron
Yeah. Was the king.
was the king. Yeah, but yeah, no access to the court. What?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, so there's that. But also the court that was being referred to, the court in question was that of the Virginia Company of London, which includes also Southampton. And Shakespeare wrote a whole... Yeah.
Southampton.
He writes a poem to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so he definitely has access to Southampton.
Mm-hmm.
And through this court, he might have had access to the document. Kinney also argues for another document, James Rosier's True Relation of 1605 being the influence, and this is a narrative of English navigation along the coast of Maine. However, Vaughan argues that True Relation involves a storm but no tempest, and then also the island that the Englishmen reach is inhabited with indigenous people, and the island that the shipwreck lands on only has 3 people plus a spirit. So yeah, it's not the same kind of population on the island versus the one that Strachey was writing about. So that's like the high level of Kinney's argument. And then also anti-Stratfordians, Roger Strittmatter and Lynn Kazitsky, attacked Strachey and his letter by claiming it was completed, quote, too late to be used as a place source, unquote, and called Strachey a, quote, notorious plagiarist even by early modern standards, unquote. And their biggest piece of evidence is taking two passages out of context, where they argue that the letter was completed after Gates' departure to London, and so Strachey must have plagiarized from other narratives. And Vaughan argues that they do not understand the logistics of ship travel. Ships would rendezvous around other ports to replenish food and other supplies and or wait for sailing conditions to clear. So essentially, like, the timeline that Strachey wrote in his narrative, like, might have been like, you know, we're planning on having the ship go out on this day, but the ship doesn't. You know, there's just all these logistics of ship travel. Like, you know, you get delayed at an airport. And you're like, oh, I'm supposed to leave on this day, and then I
So
don't.
on this way, but then like I have to like, you know, there's weather through Denver, and so like our plane is grounded until the weather in Denver is clear.
Yes, you text your friend on this day at this time saying, okay, I'm about, you know, I'm at the gate, I'm gonna leave, and then you don't because of weather. So they're just being very specific and very like too rigid about the logistics of ship travel. They also argue that there are too many similar details and word choices between Strachey's letter and other narratives, and they claim that Strachey's letter wasn't finished until 1612. But there were people writing about the exact same experience, so why would there not be overlap? And then they also argue that there are incorrect facts in Strachey's letter, which is true. There was some incorrect information, but also Strachey might have had a source that gave him incorrect information. So they're like picking apart these two passages. But in fact, there is scholarly consensus that Shakespeare was influenced by Strachey's letter. And so I'm going to kind of go through some of those pieces. So as I said at the top of my section, England thought that the Sea Venture had not arrived in Virginia. They thought it had perished in the Bermudas. And in fact, one vessel had perished, but the remaining 8 ships arrived in Chesapeake Bay by the end of August 1609. And all 150 passengers and crew were presumed dead. So in England, like, they didn't know this. They didn't know that the 150 passengers had survived. So up until the arrival of Gates, being a mail carrier in the sense, in September 1610, London learned about the account of the Bermuda episode. And it was big news. Like, people thought all of these loved ones, 150 people is a lot. They thought everybody had died. And when he arrives, there's, you know, news that they had survived. And news of the Bermuda episode spread around the city. And Vaughan notes that there must have been oral accounts by survivors, also written accounts in manuscript or print form. So it was a big deal. It's like finding out that there are survivors of the Titanic.
Yeah.
All of the written accounts were published in this collection known as the Bermuda pamphlets. And the active circulation of manuscript narratives in Renaissance England must have been widely read, and Vaughan indicates also maybe read out loud. And there are 3 lengthy assessments that reflect more than a century of traditional scholarship. I'm going to kind of go through very quickly these 3 lengthy assessments by scholars over the past century or so. So in 1901, a scholar named Morton Luce, in his first Arden edition, examined parallel passages. So he looked between the Tempest and Jourdain's discovery of the Bermudas and the Virginia Company's True Declaration, and he looked through True Repertory, and he found that all of these passages, if you parallel the passages, all 3 of these had an influence on the play. So with Jourdain's discovery of the Bermudas, it's credited within a few phrases in Act 1 and Act 2. The Virginia Company's True Declaration also has some details about the storm. And then especially pervasive is the influence of True Repertory on the storm scene and the island geography. And then in 1926, a scholar named Robert Ralston Cawley compared a longer list of words, phrases, and ideas in The Tempest with the same texts plus an additional Virginia Company's True and Sincere Declaration, and found parallels with all of these texts with the text of The Tempest. And then in 1996, David Kathman's online list of correspondences between The Tempest and the principal Bermuda pamphlets included a brief discussion of, quote, Shakespeare's access to Strachey's letter, unquote, that summarizes links between Shakespeare and several prominent men and Strachey himself. And this could have provided Shakespeare ample opportunity to see Strachey's letter. And Kathman also concluded that true repertory pervades the entire play. So there is a lot of evidence that suggests that Shakespeare took from Strachey's letter, and also he was influenced by other narratives that were being circulated by manuscripts or print or oral accounts. And I want to conclude this by reading from Vaughan's article about both texts, The Tempest and Strachey's letter. So Vaughan writes, quote, "Both texts open with eloquent and extensive descriptions of frightful storms. Strachey expends more than 2,500 words on the, quote, unmerciful tempest, unquote. Shakespeare devotes the entire first, although brief, scene to Prospero and Ariel's Tempest, as well as numerous subsequent passages, especially in conversations between Prospero and Miranda, Prospero and Ariel, and the courtiers. In both texts, deep despair gives way to amazed relief when everyone aboard miraculously survives, while the remainder of both fleets sail safely toward their destinations. In both texts, the island refuge is bountiful but troubled by storms and rife with danger from its other denizens. In both texts, conspiracies among the shipwrecked Europeans threaten the lives of the leaders and the island's tranquility. And even if Caliban is a native of the island by birth, no true humans dwelled there. Like Bermuda, it had abundant spirits. Before Europeans' arrival, piecemeal in the play, but altogether in Strachey's narrative. At the end of Strachey's chapter on the Bermuda episode, as at the end of Shakespeare's play, everyone, save respectively Bermuda's two felons in hiding in Caliban, sails hopefully away. There's much more to the Tempest storyline, of course, drawn largely from European sources, old and new, but Strachey offered a basic outline for the play's meteorological and insular elements and for many of its human interactions." Unquote.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a long-winded way of saying that if you look at parallels of the two texts, like other scholars before,
it's just pretty undeniable that there's a conversation between these two documents happening. Shakespeare's responding to Strachey's account of what happened. Also, the printing of it, I'm still hung up on that, of like being the thing that makes people go, well, it couldn't have been. It's like, do you not think that like people were talking? Like, especially like if he had access to these people, this is kind of an extraordinary story. It's possible he could have seen the manuscript. It's also possible that it's just a popular topic of conversation of like, did you hear about this crazy storm? Everybody thought they were going to die. Nobody did. It's Occam's razor. It's just so much easier to be like, yeah, these things are so similar that clearly Shakespeare knew this story.
Yeah. And it's fine that he knew the story.
And was inspired by it.
And also, that's not to say that Shakespeare wasn't inspired by other accounts of the Bermuda shipwreck and survival, but...
Or people outside of England, or that it's clear that he was reading and engaging with travel narratives.
Yes. And I think, maybe this is a controversial opinion, but I think some people try to resist it because then it means that people have to face Shakespeare as being a potential part of discourse of proto-colonialism. Whether he intended what we know happened or not, I don't know. But I think people like to keep this play in a vacuum.
Yeah. But then it's also putting this man on a like untouchable level of some sort of like non-human level that just isn't true. He can be flawed and he can be a human and he can have great plays and not so great plays. But if we look at him as a human being who's just doing his job, writing plays, trying to make money in entertainment during his time period, you know, he's just responding to, as we've seen in so many other plays, to themes and conversations that are happening around him in London.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to end it, is he's responding to what was happening in London in 1610, 1611.
Yeah. And with that, thank you for listening.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
This is Shakespeare, Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare, Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Never Ending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at ShakespeareAnyonePod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Cymbeline, Act 3, Scene 5, said by Cloten. For since patiently and constantly thou hast stuck to the bare fortune of that beggar Posthumus, thou canst not in the course of gratitude but be a diligent follower of mine.